122, 301. Do you even care when we're talking about tariffs at 10 or 15%?
The president is looking to reestablish that same rate of tariffs that he had under IEPA. And there is a smorgasbord of different congressional delegations of tariff authority that I suspect they're going to sequence into place to try and achieve that outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so when we consider what outcome President Trump would like to get, specifically what he would like to elicit from our trading partners in the form of deals, the president took to Truth Social earlier this morning to say any country that wants to, quote, play games with the ridiculous Supreme Court decision, especially those that have ripped off the USA for years and even decades, will be met with a much higher tariff and worse than which they just recently agreed to. I think he probably is alluding to the EU here, Lori. But when we consider how high those tariffs can go, is there a limit under these other authorities? Because, of course, with IEPA, he just kind of slapped whatever rate he felt appropriate. Can he do so using other legal grounds?
There are other legal grounds that actually allow quite high tariffs. So the unexplored IEPA-like instrument is a law called Section 338 of the Trade Act of 1930. It hasn't been used since World War II. No one knows how it would go if it were challenged in court, which certainly it would be, but that would take many months. That allows up to 50% for an unlimited amount of time on a presidential, basically self-finding of a fact of discrimination against the interests of the United States. So that one's very loose. The other provision, Section 232, which is you have to have a report finding a national security basis for raising tariffs, in Section 301, which requires an investigation. You need to find basically unfair practices against the United States of a particular country. Those mechanisms have more procedures on the front end, but they don't have limits on the back end with respect to how high the tariffs can go. And all of those have an unlimited time. So Section 122 is maximum 15% for a balance of payments problem for only 5 months. The other ones, the three of them, 301 and 232, have gone through the courts and have been declared fine. 338, more of a mystery, but lots of other delegated authorities for a president to use tariffs.
And for those other three approaches, how long would these investigations last? Might they outlast the midterms?
Section 338, again, not used since before I was born, is a process that can be very speedy. I guess the outlying question as far as how long it could stay in place is if it got challenged in court, how long it would take before you'd have a ruling that would take it down if it were ruled against. As far as Sections 232 and Sections 301, it's probably unhelpful to say, but it kind of depends. It depends how many countries, how many issues, and also the quality of the investigation. There have not been cases challenging the qualities of the investigations. A very good Section 301 investigation can be done in 4 or 5 months. Typically, they take longer. It just depends how many people they're going to put on it. I think that, as far as the midterms, the big X factor is, as far as Section 122, the 150 days runs out on July 24th. And then it goes to Congress to try and extend it. And that could really make an interesting political problem because members of Congress would have to go on the record right then about whether they want to extend that authority or not.
Well, and we've already heard from the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, who has suggested Democrats will not vote for an extension. That probably makes it a dead-on-arrival proposition in the Senate when we consider the 60-vote threshold. On Section 122, you mentioned how that will run out in July. Is there time between now and July for that to be challenged in a court of law? When we consider the authority he's using or the justification for using that authority, are we in a balance of payments crisis right now? Could that not end up in court?
So I recommend folks should look at the actual proclamation they issued. They actually have thought it through, and they make a case that is not wrong. It is a case that maybe could get challenged. Almost certainly, to answer the direct question, almost certainly a lawsuit's going to get filed. But in the 5 months, it seems extremely unlikely that will work its way through the courts to a point where there would be a final order. So yes, a challenge, but no, not probably a decision. As far as the merits of the case, it's not the people who are saying this is ridiculous. They're basically looking back at the time period when that statute was written, and we were just coming off of a gold-based currency. And those conditions obviously were not literally in a balance of payments crisis in the sense of checks are going to bounce. But in the sense of what a balance of payments crisis is with respect to our overall current account balance and other factors, you can make the case, which they do in this proclamation, and economists watching, everyone look and come back to us trade lawyers and say what you think. But yeah, I think that it will get challenged. I also think, though, that they've got other potential laws to put in place that they could do in that period of time. The much bigger X factor, honestly, is the refunds.
Well, I'm glad you just brought that up, because as we wait to hear from the mayor of New York, he's going to be holding a news conference any moment now on the storm cleanup. Lori, there are huge questions about refunds. No one's got any answers, and we know a lot of lawsuits have already been filed and were filed in advance of the Supreme Court ruling. We heard earlier today from the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, was speaking with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio with his thoughts on the prospect of paying back all this money. Listen.
In regards to the tariffs, I think it's very certain there's probably not going to be any refunds. I don't see a pathway in Congress that there's going to be refunds. And so you're going to look at over the course of President Trump's administration, he's going to continue to use those tariff revenues to bring down the deficit.
What do you think about Congressman Jason Smith there, Lori? And if you're a Costco, for instance, and you already filed suit, does that put you at the front of the line potentially?
So I suspect there are a lot of people in boardrooms who have a very different take than Chairman Smith about that question. And honestly, as a trade lawyer, I would say the question is not an if, it's actually a how question. There's a history of tariffs being refunded and there are different mechanisms. The thing that's particularly thorny with this situation as compared to the usual situation, which is, say, a preference program, like the generalized system of preferences, doesn't get renewed. And so you have to pay in for an extra year when it should have been renewed and you wouldn't have had to pay, then that money comes back. In this instance, the tariffs were so broad on so many goods affecting so many countries that actually there's a big question where there's a gap between who is booked at customs for the entity that paid a tariff and who actually paid. So as a practical matter, it's going to be extremely difficult to figure out a fair way to do it. So Costco is so big that in some circumstances, I bet their procurement people would fess up to the fact they probably made their foreign suppliers cover a lot of the tariff by either giving them a lower price on the good or by literally paying a payment to have to cover that expense as a condition for continuing to source from that particular tariffed entity overseas. So the big companies that have dominant market positions and basically monopoly power could avoid paying. Some of them then, not saying Costco did, passed on expenses to consumers. So even though they didn't pay, they raised their prices. And then you've got companies that raised prices that didn't get charged tariffs at all. So you've got a big question of how the consumer is made whole.
Yeah.
How you don't end up with windfall profits from companies that didn't pay but are booked as paying. And then there's always the question for small businesses. What is a system that hopefully is even less complicated than like paycheck protection so they don't have to go to court?
Well, Lori, when we consider these questions around refunds, I would point to what a former senator from Ohio, hoping to be a senator from Ohio, again, Sherrod Brown, the Democrat, is out on X posting about today. He says he's calling for a $1,336 refund for every Ohio household, saying that the reckless tariffs ruled illegal by the Supreme Court cost Ohioans $6.5 billion. That's not really how this will work, though, right? You aren't going to see direct checks to households like that.
You know, given the complexity I was just describing, that's as fair of a way of doing it, honestly.
Really?
Than anything that's going to come out one way or another, there's going to be an unfairness. And given how many people have been hit, it by rising prices, some of it, again, price gouging using the cover of tariffs. I mean, the beef situation is a classic. 80% of the beef we eat in the U.S. is grown and processed here. So only 20% of imports, and of that, half of it has always been duty-free because it comes from Mexico and Canada, which from day one under the Trump tariffs have had a duty-free exception. So we've seen the prices of beef go through the ceiling, has nothing to do with tariffs, yet it's been claimed by the grocery stores, the meat packers, oh, we can't help you, it's tariffs, we have to pass through the price. So if you had, for instance, the Costcos and those guys who have the wherewithal to sue, getting back the money, but actually a lot of consumers have been the ones who in the end paid, and some of the big retailers didn't pay at all because they had the leverage to make someone else carry it for them. How is that fairer than Senator Brown's idea of giving everyone a check?
Wow. Lori, it's fascinating and refreshing to speak with someone who knows as much about this as you do, because there are a lot of armchair experts in Washington right now when it comes to tariffs. The president said on Friday when he met the press after the ruling, going forward, we will be able to take in more money and there will no longer be doubt. Is the first part of that true? He will be able to take in more money from fill in the blank, whether it's consumer, importer, or foreign country, with the new tariff regime than the old one?
I think it is hypothetically possible, although seems somewhat improbable. So as a legal matter, if they used all of the authorities that they have, at least like in the year period, the short term, they might be able to bring in the 150 billion. That is more or less what I think the most clean estimates are of the revenue they brought in to date since Liberation Day. And I think, you know, with the laws that they have, they could do that. They could approximate the same kind of tariff levels that they were able to do under IEEPA. Whether or not that's what they're going to do is a different question.